Imagine this. It's June 1944. You're a German officer staring at a massive map of northern France. Across the English Channel, your scouts report hundreds of ships gathering off the coast of Dover. Thousands of radio signals burst through the air, all pointing to one place, Pas de Calais. And leading the charge, they say, is General George S. Patton, the most aggressive and unpredictable commander in the Allied Army. Everything fits perfectly. The geography, the timing, the troops. So when you hear that some small Allied forces have landed somewhere called Normandy, you barely flinch. It must be a diversion, you think. The real invasion, the big one, will come soon, across the narrowest point of the channel. But then days pass, weeks, and suddenly you realize there is no second attack. You've been watching ghosts. Because the army you feared, the tanks, the ships, the soldiers, even Patton himself, never existed. They were illusions, crafted not by generals or spies, but by artists, carpenters, radio operators, and even movie technicians. This was Operation Fortitude, a deception so brilliant it rewrote the rules of modern warfare. A plan that fooled Hitler's best intelligence officers, delayed reinforcements for weeks, and gave the Allies the foothold they needed to retake Europe. But perhaps the most incredible part? Behind the smoke and mirrors stood ordinary people, filmmakers, painters, engineers, people who used imagination as their weapon. They didn't fire bullets, they painted them. And their masterpiece changed the course of history. When we talk about D-Day, we often picture soldiers storming the beaches of Normandy, the roar of gunfire and the courage that filled those gray waters. But hidden behind that heroism was another battlefield, one fought in shadows and whispers with canvas tanks, wooden planes, and invisible armies. This is the untold story of how creativity defeated tyranny. And it all began with a quiet idea. An idea born not in a war room, but in a dusty workshop on the outskirts of London, where imagination was about to become a weapon. Because before there was Fortitude, there was a man who dreamed of fake airfields, and a movie studio that decided to go to war. That story didn't begin on the battlefield, but in a dusty workshop on the outskirts of London, where imagination was about to become a weapon.
Every great story begins with a small idea, and for Operation Fortitude, the seed of deception was planted in the autumn of 1940, in one of the darkest chapters of Britain's history. London burned under the Blitz. Sirens screamed every night as families rushed into bomb shelters while German bombers roared above. The Royal Air Force fought with courage, but its resources were stretched thin. Airfields were being destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt. In the middle of all this chaos stood Colonel John Turner, a quiet, practical engineer who worked for the Air Ministry. Turner wasn't a soldier on the front lines. He was the man responsible for designing and constructing RAF airfields. But as the bombs kept falling, he realized that Britain's survival depended not only on strength, but also on illusion. Planes are weapons, he once said, but the enemy's belief, that's the real battlefield. Turner's idea was simple but revolutionary. If the Germans were bombing the RAF's airfields, then why not build fake ones? Instead of steel and concrete, they could use wood and canvas. Instead of costly fighter planes, they could build replicas. Cheap, light, and convincing enough from 20,000 feet. He believed that if the Luftwaffe could be tricked into wasting bombs on empty fields, the real air bases might be spared. Not everyone shared his faith. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, head of Fighter Command, dismissed the plan immediately. "We need real planes, Turner, not toys," he said. But Turner refused to give up. He argued that deception could save lives, and eventually the Air Ministry allowed him to proceed. His next problem was finding someone who could actually create the illusion. The early prototypes were far too complex and expensive. The contractors were treating them like scale models, building every rivet, every marking, every detail. Turner didn't need perfection. He needed something that looked right from the sky. What he needed wasn't a manufacturer. He needed an artist. That artist came from an unexpected place, the British film industry. Just west of London, in a quiet corner of Surrey, stood a place called Shepperton Studios. Its owner, a Scottish entrepreneur named Norman Loudon, had built it years earlier as a dream factory for filmmakers. By 1939, Shepperton was one of the most advanced studios in Europe, equipped with sound stages, lighting workshops, and an entire team of carpenters, painters, and set designers. But when the war began, film production collapsed. Projects were canceled, technicians were drafted, and the studios fell silent. Then Colonel Turner appeared at Loudon's office with a proposal that sounded almost absurd. "I need airplanes," Turner said, "but they don't have to fly. They just have to look real, from above." Loudon looked at him for a moment and smiled. "Colonel," he replied, "that's exactly what we do."
That handshake marked a turning point. The film industry had officially joined the war. Soon, the sound stages of Shepperton echoed once more, not with actors or cameras, but with the noise of saws and hammers. The studio's craftsmen began building full-size models of Wellington and Blenheim bombers using wood, cloth, and wire. They painted them carefully to match the dull camouflage tones of real aircraft and placed them on makeshift airfields across southern England. From 20,000 feet, German reconnaissance pilots saw what looked like rows of bombers glinting in the sun. They were fooled. Luftwaffe bombers targeted those fake airfields, dropping tons of explosives on harmless decoys, while the real RAF bases nearby remained untouched. Turner's gamble had paid off. What began as an engineer's crazy dream had become one of the most successful deceptions of the war. For Norman Loudon and his studio crew, it was redemption. The same men who once built castles and city streets for films were now building illusions that saved lives. Turner's collaboration with Shepperton proved something powerful. In war, creativity could be as vital as courage. Word of their success spread quickly. Within months, dozens of fake airfields were built across the country. The Luftwaffe wasted bombs, time, and fuel attacking shadows. And though the world didn't know it yet, these wooden planes had quietly laid the foundation for an entirely new weapon, deception itself. What started as an act of survival was becoming an art form. And like any art, it was about understanding how people see, how they think, and how they can be led to believe a story that isn't real. Turner and Loudon had built illusions that fooled pilots. But what if someone could build illusions that fooled generals? What if an entire enemy army could be misled, not by strength, but by imagination? That question reached all the way to Cairo, where a brilliant and eccentric British officer named Dudley Clark heard about Turner's fake airfields. Clark was known for his wit, his charm, and his unconventional mind. He understood the psychology of warfare better than most. What Turner had done with airfields, Clark believed he could do with armies. "If we can build a fake airfield," Clark later said, "why not build a fake army?" That question, simple yet audacious, would ignite one of the most extraordinary chapters in the history of military deception. It would lead to a plan so daring, so imaginative, that it would help change the course of the entire war. And so, from the sawdust floors of a quiet British film studio to the vast deserts of North Africa, the art of illusion was about to evolve. Turner had created the seed. Clark would make it bloom.
By 1941, while John Turner and his team in England were perfecting their fake airfields, another kind of war was taking shape thousands of miles away across the deserts of North Africa. And at the center of it was a man named Colonel Dudley Clark, an officer unlike any other in the British Army. Clark didn't fit the image of a traditional soldier. He was sharp-witted, restless, and imaginative, more like a playwright than a military commander. But what set him apart was his understanding that wars were not only won with weapons, they were won with stories. Clark believed that the most powerful victories came not from destroying the enemy's forces,
but from shaping the enemy's perception of reality. Born in South Africa and raised in a family with a long military tradition, Clark had served in several intelligence roles before the Second World War. When he arrived in Cairo in 1940, the British campaign in North Africa was in serious trouble. The desert was vast and unforgiving, communication lines were fragile, and morale was low. Clark quickly realized that brute force would not be enough to turn the tide. If the Allies were to survive, they needed to outthink their enemy. He began to see warfare as a grand stage play, where the goal was to make the opponent believe in a story of your choosing. To Clark, deception was not just a tactic, it was theater. Every operation needed a believable plot, convincing characters, and just enough truth to make the lie feel real. In 1941, Clark founded a small secret unit within British military intelligence called A-Force. Its mission was unlike any other in the British Army, not to fight the Germans, but to manipulate them. Their objective was to make the enemy act in ways that benefited the Allies, even if that meant creating entire realities out of thin air. Clark's first experiment was modest but clever. He wanted the Italians to believe that the British were preparing a large airborne assault behind their lines in North Africa. The problem was, Britain had no paratroopers in the region at all. So Clark invented them. He created a fictional formation called the 1st Parachute Brigade, complete with insignia, forged documents, and whispers planted through double agents. Soon, Italian reconnaissance reports were filled with sightings of British paratroopers who didn't exist. Units were redeployed, defenses shifted, and resources were wasted, all because of a story Clark had written. That success confirmed what he had always believed. An illusion, if believable enough, could move real armies. Encouraged, Clark began to expand his ideas. He turned the desert into his stage. His team built dummy tanks from wood and canvas, mounted them on trucks, and moved them across the dunes to create the illusion of entire armored divisions. They constructed fake oil pipelines, supply dumps, and even radio stations that broadcasted artificial traffic to simulate large military movements. Everything had to fit into a coherent narrative, a story the enemy's intelligence officers could discover and confirm. Before the Battle of El Alamein in 1942, Clark put on his greatest show yet. The real attack, led by General Bernard Montgomery, was to come from the north. But Clark needed the Germans to believe that the main offensive would strike from the south. His men spent weeks creating that illusion. Tracks carved into the sand, hundreds of dummy tanks, fake fuel depots, and radio chatter implying a massive buildup of forces. When German reconnaissance planes flew over, they saw exactly what Clark wanted them to see. The trick worked perfectly. The Germans stationed 2 panzer divisions to guard against a phantom army in the south, weakening their defenses where Montgomery's real forces attacked. When the battle began, the Germans were caught off guard. El Alamein became one of the most important Allied victories in North Africa, and Clark's deception played a quiet but critical role in making it possible.
Clark's genius lay in his understanding of human psychology. He knew that the most effective lies were not outrageous fabrications, but subtle distortions of truth. A believable lie, he often said, must be 99% true. His goal was never to confuse the enemy completely, but to lead them confidently in the wrong direction. If the Germans expected an attack, he gave them one, just not where or when it would actually happen. He also understood that deception must always provoke action. A good lie, Clark wrote, is one that makes the enemy move. His operations weren't designed to trick the Germans into sitting still. They were designed to make them waste time, troops, and fuel responding to threats that didn't exist. Every fake airfield, every dummy tank, every radio signal was a way to guide the enemy's hand, to make them play the wrong move in a game they didn't realize they were losing. Under Clark's leadership, deception evolved from an improvisation into a refined military art. His unit, A-Force, became the model for similar operations across the Allied forces. British commanders began to recognize that deception wasn't just a clever trick, it was a strategic necessity.
By 1943, Clark's success in North Africa had made him a legend within Allied intelligence circles. His work proved that deception could change the course of entire campaigns, not just individual battles. He was brought back to London to share what he had learned, and his lessons soon reached the highest levels of command. Among the officers who studied his methods were those planning the greatest amphibious invasion in history, the liberation of Western Europe. Clark's principles were simple but profound. Every lie needed a purpose. Every illusion needed evidence to support it. Every story had to be consistent, logical, and self-reinforcing. Never overplay your hand, he advised. Make the enemy complete the story for you. One of his most influential ideas was the concept of fictional armies, vast military formations that existed only on paper and in the enemy's imagination. These ghost divisions would have fake insignia, fake bases, fake commanders, and fake communication lines. They would be seen by spies, heard on radio frequencies, and confirmed by reconnaissance photographs. In truth, they would be nothing more than shadows and whispers. That idea would soon form the backbone of a deception operation on a scale never before attempted. An operation designed to mislead the entire German high command about where the Allies planned to invade France. It would be the ultimate test of everything Clark had learned, combining technology, intelligence, and artistry into a single masterstroke. Dudley Clark never led an army into battle, but his fingerprints can be found on countless victories. His work blurred the line between truth and fiction, between war and theater. "My job," he once joked, "is to tell stories that make the enemy move." He did exactly that, and in doing so, he reshaped modern warfare. By late 1943, Clark's techniques had spread far beyond the deserts of North Africa. They had become the foundation for a new kind of strategy, one where the battlefield existed as much in the mind as on the ground. As Allied commanders prepared for the invasion of Europe, they turned once again to Clark's ideas, determined to create an illusion so convincing that even Hitler himself would believe it. Soon, his theories would come to life on a scale he could scarcely have imagined, with fake armies, phantom tanks, and ghost fleets stretching across the English countryside. The stage was set for the most ambitious deception in military history.
By late 1943, the war in Europe was approaching a decisive moment. The Allies had pushed the Axis out of North Africa, invaded Italy, and were now preparing for the greatest gamble of all, the liberation of Western Europe. The plan was to land hundreds of thousands of troops on the French coast and open a new front against Nazi Germany. But Hitler and his generals already knew an invasion was coming. The only question left was where it would strike. To the Germans, the most logical target was the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, only about 20 miles wide, heavily fortified, and closest to Germany's industrial heartland. Every map, every logistical calculation pointed to Calais as the place where the Allies should land. That assumption would become the foundation for one of the greatest illusions ever performed in warfare. The real invasion, Operation Overlord, would target Normandy, farther west, where defenses were thinner. But the success of Overlord depended on keeping the Germans from realizing that. The Allies had to make Hitler believe that the Normandy landings were merely a distraction, a prelude to a much larger assault on Calais. If they could do that, German reinforcements would stay pinned down hundreds of miles away, waiting for an attack that would never come. That mission, to deceive the entire German high command, became Operation Fortitude. Fortitude was not a single trick, but a grand symphony of lies, performed across Britain with precision and imagination. It was the ultimate expression of everything men like John Turner and Dudley Clark had learned over years of experimentation. That deception, when done well, could shape the outcome of history. The first step was to make the illusion believable. For that, the Allies needed a fake army. They created the first U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG, a completely fictional military formation supposedly consisting of over 300,000 troops. On paper, it was commanded by one of the most famous generals in the world, George S. Patton, whose reputation for aggression and brilliance made him the perfect choice.
To the Germans, it made perfect sense. Patton was the Allies' most feared field commander. If he was in charge of a new army assembling in southeast England, then surely that was where the main blow would fall. In reality, FUSAG existed only in the imagination. But to make it convincing, the Allies had to build it as if it were real. Across the countryside of Kent, Essex, and Suffolk, the landscape transformed into a theater of illusions. Engineers and stage designers, many of them from British film studios like Shepperton, built hundreds of dummy tanks from canvas and wood. Inflatable trucks and artillery pieces dotted the fields. On the coasts near Dover, they erected fake landing craft made of plywood and barrels floating in the shallows to mimic an invasion fleet. From the air, German reconnaissance planes photographed what appeared to be a massive buildup of Allied forces. Thousands of vehicles, ships, and soldiers ready to cross the channel at any moment. What they saw was exactly what the Allies wanted them to see. But visual illusions were only the beginning. The true strength of Fortitude lay in its integration of every intelligence and communication tool available. The Allies used radio deception, controlled leaks, and double agents in a coordinated effort to sustain the illusion. Special radio operators transmitted a constant stream of fake messages between FUSAG headquarters and its divisions, detailing training exercises, logistics, and schedules for the upcoming invasion. The Germans intercepted all of it. The sheer volume of radio traffic seemed to confirm that a huge army was mobilizing in southeast England. Meanwhile, a network of double agents, part of a British intelligence operation known as the Double Cross System, fed carefully crafted reports to their German handlers. The most famous of them, Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo, became instrumental in Fortitude's success. Garbo provided the Germans with inside information that perfectly matched the false narrative the Allies wanted to sell. His fabricated spy network of imaginary subagents gave credibility to every message he sent. Garbo's reports described supply shortages, unit relocations, and training activities, all of which painted a picture of an enormous army preparing to strike at Calais. The Germans trusted him completely. By 1944, Hitler himself referred to Garbo's intelligence as among the most reliable sources they had. To reinforce the illusion, even physical infrastructure was manipulated. The Allies constructed mock oil depots, vehicle parks, and ammunition dumps. They staged fake nighttime activity with lights and sounds of engines. Trains full of empty crates moved regularly towards southeast England to simulate logistical support. On radar, fake signals mimicked convoys crossing the channel. Every sensory channel available to German intelligence was filled with convincing evidence of a massive army that didn't exist. At the same time, the Allies took great care to make the real invasion force in southwest England look small and unremarkable. Radio silence was maintained, troop movements were concealed under cover of darkness, and camouflage was perfected to hide the buildup in the ports of Devon and Cornwall. The contrast between the quiet west and the boiling east only made the deception more believable. When D-Day finally arrived on June 6, 1944, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. Despite the scale of the operation, the German High Command hesitated to react decisively. The deception had worked so well that they refused to believe Normandy was the main target. They assumed it was a diversion, that the real invasion, led by Patton's fictional FUSAG, would come at Calais within days. Even as the battle raged in Normandy, Hitler kept the powerful 15th German Army, over 150,000 men and hundreds of tanks, waiting at Calais. For more than 7 weeks after D-Day, they stayed in position, expecting Patton's army to strike. That delay allowed the Allies to secure a foothold in France, break through German defenses, and begin the liberation of Western Europe. Operation Fortitude had achieved exactly what it was designed to do. It bought the Allies precious time, saved thousands of lives, and ensured the success of the Normandy invasion. It was the largest and most successful deception operation in military history. But beyond the strategic brilliance, Fortitude revealed something deeper about the nature of war. That victory often belongs not to the strongest, but to the most imaginative. It was the culmination of everything that had begun years earlier with Turner's wooden airplanes and Clark's desert illusions. The operation transformed deception from a battlefield trick into an art form, a masterpiece crafted with carpenters, painters, radio men, and spies instead of soldiers and guns. Every participant, from generals to stage designers, played a part in the performance. And at the center of that performance stood the perfect actor, a man whose reputation alone could make the lie feel real.
In every great performance, there's a leading man, someone whose presence alone makes the story believable. In Operation Fortitude, that man was General George S. Patton. Patton was larger than life, bold, brash, and unapologetically confident. He was the kind of man who filled every room he entered. To his soldiers, he was both terrifying and inspiring. To the Germans, he was a living legend. They feared him more than any other Allied commander. If Patton was in charge, it meant one thing: a major attack was coming. That reputation made him the perfect star for the Allies' grand deception. After a public outburst during the Sicily campaign, Patton had been quietly sidelined by Allied command. But instead of fading from view, he was given a new secret role. Not to lead real troops into battle, but to play a part in the greatest illusion of the war. Patton became the face of the first U.S. Army group, FUSAG, the massive Phantom Army that supposedly waited in southeast England for the invasion of France. His mere name gave the operation instant credibility. German intelligence was obsessed with tracking his movements. Wherever Patton went, they believed the real invasion would follow. So the Allies made sure he was seen, but only where they wanted him to be seen. Patton toured bases that didn't exist, reviewed dummy tanks, and delivered fiery speeches to soldiers who were actually actors and clerks. Newspapers ran stories about his new command, and spies made sure those stories reached Berlin. To the Germans, everything lined up perfectly. The famous General Patton, commanding a massive force in Kent opposite the Pas-de-Calais. It was exactly what they expected. They dismissed the Normandy landings as a diversion. In their minds, the real storm was still gathering, and Patton was at its center. For weeks after D-Day, the Germans waited for Patton's army to strike. They saw the fake radio transmissions, intercepted Garbo's intel, and studied reconnaissance photos of wooden ships and inflatable tanks. It all seemed real. Hitler himself refused to move the 15th Army from Calais because he believed Patton would lead the true invasion any day. In the end, Patton's greatest performance wasn't on a battlefield. It was on a stage made of lies and illusions, and he played his role flawlessly. Without firing a single shot, he helped shape the outcome of the war. It's almost poetic. The most feared warrior of the Allies became the most convincing actor of them all. His name, his presence, and his pride became the ultimate weapon of deception. And while Patton stood in England playing his part, the real soldiers, the ones who would face the fire, were preparing across the Channel. The stage was set, the enemy was watching the wrong direction, and the greatest gamble of the war was about to begin.
By the first week of June 1944, the stage was set. Across the southern coast of England, real soldiers, not wooden tanks or ghost divisions, were preparing for the greatest amphibious invasion in history. Operation Overlord was ready to begin. But even as the troops loaded into their landing craft, the success of the mission still depended on a lie. Everything that had been built, the fake army, the dummy tanks, the radio traffic, the deception network, all of it had one purpose: to make sure the Germans believed that Normandy wasn't the real target. On the night of June 5th, under heavy clouds and fierce winds, Allied paratroopers boarded their planes. The invasion was already underway. Meanwhile, the German High Command, confident that Calais was the true objective, remained focused on the wrong stretch of coastline. When dawn broke on June 6, 1944, 5 beaches in Normandy erupted into chaos. More than 150,000 Allied soldiers crossed the English Channel that day, braving rough seas, machine gun fire, and fortified defenses. It was one of the most perilous days in modern history. And yet, even as the fighting raged, the deception continued to protect them. In Berlin, Hitler's generals couldn't believe that Normandy was the main invasion. Reports from their trusted agents, including Garbo, insisted that a much larger attack was still coming at Calais. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights over southeast England seemed to confirm it. They saw Patton's army still waiting, ships still docked, and radio chatter still active. The illusion held perfectly. For the next several days, Hitler refused to move his armored divisions from Calais. He believed the Normandy landings were just a feint, a clever distraction. The real blow, he told his staff, will come at Calais. Even as Allied troops fought their way inland, through hedgerows, villages, and fields soaked in blood, the German 15th Army sat idle, hundreds of miles away, waiting for a battle that never arrived. Those lost days changed everything. By the time Hitler finally realized the truth, it was too late. The Allies had secured the beaches, captured ports, and begun pouring reinforcements into France. The deception had bought them the one resource no army can ever have enough of: time. Fortitude didn't just fool the enemy, it shielded the truth long enough for it to triumph. Every wooden tank, every false radio signal, every whispered lie, all of it came together to protect the men who stormed those beaches. The deception wasn't about pride or trickery. It was about survival. It was about giving real soldiers, young men barely out of high school, a fighting chance to live through the impossible. Many of them never made it home. The beaches of Normandy, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword became names carved into history and memory. But behind that victory, behind every inch of ground won with blood, there was also an invisible army of artists, engineers, and dreamers who fought not with guns, but with imagination. The success of D-Day proved that courage alone doesn't win wars. Courage must be guided by intelligence, by creativity, and by the will to make the enemy see the world you want them to see. The soldiers on the beaches were protected not only by steel helmets and rifles, but by the power of belief. When the sun set on June 6, 1944, the world had changed forever. The greatest invasion in history had succeeded, and it had done so under the shelter of a magnificent illusion. Operation Fortitude had done its job. The truth, the real invasion at Normandy, had survived because a lie had stood guard over it. In the end, D-Day was not just a triumph of arms. It was a triumph of imagination and unity, a moment when every deception, every secret, and every act of faith aligned to make the impossible possible. And as the smoke cleared over Normandy, the men behind the deception, the dreamers, the tricksters, the storytellers, stepped quietly back into the shadows. Their work was done. The war still raged, but history was already turning. When the guns fell silent and the beaches of Normandy were finally secured, the world began to understand the scale of what had been achieved, not just through strength, but through imagination. The victory of D-Day was written not only by soldiers who fought on the sand, but by dreamers who fought with shadows and stories. Operation Fortitude was more than a deception. It was a masterpiece of human creativity, proof that intelligence, art, and courage could coexist on the same battlefield. Behind every wooden tank and fake radio signal stood people who understood something profound, that in war, as in life, perception can shape reality. The success of Fortitude didn't end on D-Day. Its effects rippled far beyond the beaches of France. For weeks afterward, Hitler's armies stayed frozen in Calais, waiting for an attack that never came. Those precious weeks allowed the Allies to pour men and supplies into France, liberate Paris, and march toward victory.
The lies of Fortitude had bought the truth enough time to win. And when the war finally ended, the architects of that deception, the engineers, filmmakers, artists, and intelligence officers slipped quietly back into ordinary life. Most never spoke of what they had done. Their names didn't appear in headlines or history books. But their work changed the course of history, proving that imagination is not just for artists, it is a weapon, a force that can defend freedom itself. Looking back, Operation Fortitude reminds us that heroism takes many forms. Some heroes charged the beaches under fire. Others painted decoy aircraft, built fake armies, or whispered lies that saved thousands of lives. Each one, in their own way, believed in something bigger than themselves, in a future where truth and peace could finally prevail. In the end, the story of Fortitude is the story of human ingenuity, of how art and intelligence, deception and courage came together to defend hope in humanity's darkest hour. It is a reminder that even in war, creativity can be an act of love, and that sometimes the greatest truths are protected by the most beautiful lies. If you love hidden stories of history, the untold battles, the quiet heroes, the brilliant minds who changed the world without ever firing a shot, then this is just the beginning. There are countless stories like Fortitude waiting to be uncovered. Moments when imagination shaped destiny and courage wore 1,000 faces. So, if that kind of history speaks to you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and join us for more journeys into the past, where truth and wonder meet, and the smallest details still have the power to change everything. Because sometimes the greatest stories are the ones the world almost forgot.